I'll just do a quick roll call for people to know who's in the room versus, and for the people in the room, I'll read who's participating virtually. So in the room, we have Casey Kostick, Bob Brown, Pam Sebeski, Ann Wheeler, Gary Ehrenrich, and John Lynch. And online, we have Amir Shapar, Christine Hefner, Dan Maliff, Heather Edelman, Jeff King, Jim Ponicello, Julia Koster, Megan Landis, Maria Sinner, Mark Mishler, Mark Rawlings, Maddie Bizerto, Matt Arcieri, Mayor Rochelle, Victor Angry, Pam Sebeski's online too, Paolo Belita, Regina Moore, Sri Napuri, and Stacy Cook from TPB. That's it. Thank you. Sorry about that. I talk so loud, I figure everyone can already hear me, even in virtual land.
So, thank you, Madam Chair. I will start with a very brief recap of where the TPB is with its work to update the region's long-range transportation plan. Since this work on climate change mitigation is tied to our long-range plan update, federal regulations require that the long-range transportation plan be updated at least every 4 years. Prior to this update, the last quadrennial update was in 2018. This plan has to be updated this year, 2022. TPB began this update work in December of 2020. Last summer, the board approved all of the projects, programs, and policies which will be included in this updated long-range plan. But before the TPB can actually adopt this plan, it is required to conduct an air quality conformity analysis. The TPB authorized staff to do this analysis last summer. That analysis has now been completed, and members will be briefed about it later today. The results show that both the volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides, which are the precursors to ground level ozone, will be below the federally established. So that's the good news. So these results of the conformity analysis and the draft document of the updated long-range transportation plan were already released for public review and comments on April 1st. The draft plan that was released has several new items in it, and one of them is an entire section on mitigating climate change impacts. The findings from the TPB's climate change mitigation study was already included in the draft document. So that's the concept. The TPB had previously stated its intent to consider taking two specific actions related to climate change. One, adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals specifically for the on-road sector. Two, adopting a set of on-road greenhouse gas reduction strategies. The TPB members took a survey on these two items, and the survey was developed using the information garnered from the TPB's climate change mitigation study. Today's work session begins the TPB process of reviewing the results of the survey and discussing what specific actions the TPB wishes to take regarding climate change mitigation at this time. The TPB will have the month of April and May to discuss and decide these two topics. Whatever actions the TPB takes in June with regards to greenhouse gas reduction goals and a set of strategies to reduce on-road greenhouse gas emissions, those will be added and to the plan document, and it will become part of the TPB's planning process moving forward. So in closing, the purpose of today's work session is to allow members to reach a preliminary agreement on a set of greenhouse gas reduction goals and strategies. In closing, I will note that this is not the only time that the board can add items to the long-range plan document. Another update of this plan is scheduled for 2026, when we can add additional items or make changes to the items we add today. We can also add and make changes to the plan document in future updates beyond 2026 as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanti. Are there any questions on the purpose or what we're hoping to achieve in this work session? Start with the people. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah. Hi, Gary Aaronrich, Montgomery County. Kanti, I thought we were doing an update in 2024, in 2 years.
Yes.
To the plan.
You said 2026?
You said 2026.
Oh, okay. No,
Okay.
2024.
Thank you.
Got to go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other from anyone else in the room? Lynn, or those doing this stuff online, are there any questions for Kanti from online? Okay. Hopefully everyone understands what our purpose is here today. Let's move on to the second item on the agenda, the results of the survey. Tim, take it away.
Thank you, Chair Sabeski. Just as a housekeeping item, I was reported to me that there's noise coming in from other microphones from people who are here in the meeting. So if you're not talking, kindly mute your mic, and that might reduce some of the background noise. But I'm very pleased to be here today. Now we'll get on to the business. Thank you, Chair Sabeski. I'm going to refer to several items that were part of the meeting packet. Online, there was posted a memo from me. Along with that was an appendix that contained detailed comments from the open comments in the survey, as well as the presentation. Can we get the presentation up? So I'll start by talking about the memo a little bit. Earlier this year, Chair Sabeski, Vice Chairs Ruben Collins, and Christina Henderson proposed that the TPB should explicitly adopt greenhouse gas reduction goals for the on-road transportation sector, consistent and commensurate with the region's overall greenhouse gas goals. And two, explicitly endorse a set of multi-pathway strategies to reduce on-road greenhouse gas emissions and commit toward implementing them in an equitable and expeditious manner. The intent of this was to add climate change mitigation considerations as a priority in transportation decision-making to inform projects, programs, and policies that would be included in farmers' transportation plans. As a result of this, staff developed a questionnaire to solicit input from TPB members on climate change mitigation goals and strategies. Collectively, I'll refer to those as climate change mitigation elements, to facilitate the board's deliberation on this subject. The climate change mitigation elements adopted by the board would then be incorporated into the 2022 update of the Long-Range Transportation Plan, Visualize 2045. So a little bit about the process that we conducted to administer the questionnaire. A questionnaire was sent to every TPB member on February 28, 2022, using the online platform SurveyMonkey. The questionnaire was sent to the primary TPB member of every jurisdiction agency comprising the membership of TPB. If there was a post that was vacant, that online questionnaire was sent to the alternate in that case. Copies were also sent to TPB alternates and to the members of the TPB Technical Committee to assist and consult with TPB members charged with completing the survey. And the reason for this was that we were asking for the responses to be prepared to reflect the general view of the governing entity that the member represented. So we understood that collaboration and cooperation might be necessary among the senior leadership within that jurisdiction. The online survey remained open until April 11th, 2022. Once the survey was closed, we tallied of the 44 TPB members that received the survey, that include 39 voting members and 5 ex officio members. 31 completed the surveys that were returned to us. That amounted to a 79%, or nearly 4 out of every 5 among voting members. The questionnaire, a copy of that was provided as attachment 1 to my memo. There are three, it consists of 20 multi-part questions grouped into 3 broad categories: adopting on-road transportation greenhouse gas reduction goals, consideration of greenhouse reduction goals in decision-making, and C, on-road transportation greenhouse reduction strategies to adopt. Each question contained both a closed response portion, where respondents selected a single response or multiple responses, depending on the question, as well as an opportunity to provide additional comments through an open response portion. Closed responses were tabulated as they were reported. In other words, we did not strive to weight them or interpret them in any way other than the way they were provided to us. With one exception, there were 2 components to the closed responses, and those 2 components included responses regarding actions that can be taken by TPB. In the presentation that I'll be presenting in a few minutes, those will be the charts that show the blue charts, the blue bars on the part charts. And the other group was responses regarding what actions or activities are being undertaken or what support exists within the respondent's jurisdiction or agency. And for those charts in the presentation, those are reflected with the green bars. When staff was reviewing the open comments, we received quite a lot of them, and they're documented in the appendix. We did observe that there were 10 kind of overarching themes that we could discern from the comments. I'll just read through them really quickly, and I'll point out to how you can interpret that information as we go through the presentation. These 10 themes include equity concerns, alignment with plans or activities, general agreement, implementation concern, more study or refinement desired, call for more action, more coordination would be needed, limited authority or influence, resource constraint, or do not support. Now on with the show. Oh yeah. So this presentation will consist of an outline of the survey itself, and I went through that a little bit, so I'll skip over some of these pretty quickly, as well as an overarching executive summary set of bullets for each of the 3 parts of the survey that I'll get into. And then I'll walk us through as many slides as I can, given the time. There's a lot of information there, but really the intent behind the memo, as well as all the attachments, is really to be provided to you as a resource to better understand where your colleagues stand on different issues and the prevailing opinion that was recorded during the survey. So hopefully that will continue to be a resource for you, even if I skip over a few of those. Part A, greenhouse gas reduction goals. We asked about the jurisdictions and agencies' own actions, as well as TPB adopting for on-road transportation sector. In Part B, we asked about greenhouse gas reduction in local decision-making, in your decision-making. In Part C, we asked for about specific strategies to adopt. Should TPB adopt these strategies that were mentioned in these questions? And what activities and willingness are underway at each of the jurisdictions and agencies who responded to implement the strategies within this the 3rd section. So in terms of the Part A, greenhouse gas reduction goals, we did find that a majority of the respondents do have multi-sector greenhouse reduction goals. Many have greenhouse reduction goals for the on-road sector. And when asked about whether TPB should adopt greenhouse gas reduction goals for the on-road sector, nearly 2/3 of the respondents indicated that it should. In terms of Part B, greenhouse gas reduction in decision-making, excuse me, lost my notes. 48% indicate their jurisdiction or agency considers greenhouse gas emissions in their decision-making, while 81 said their ability to include greenhouse gas reduction consideration in their decision-making are impacted by other local, state, sub-regional, or regional entities that also have a role. In terms of Part C, the overarching results of whether TPB should adopt a set of greenhouse gas reduction strategies. 15 specific strategies were included in this portion of the questionnaire. The majority of the responses, or a plurality of the responses, support TPB's adoption of 7 of these strategies, 47%. A majority or plurality of the responses support further exploration, a little bit more than half of the remaining 8 strategies that were included in the survey. Additional information on the responses were provided as comments, and again, those are documented in the appendix that are part of your packet. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the results, and in the first few slides, I'm going to walk through how to read these slides as well, and then that will taper off as I get into more of the details. But this first one, for Part A, does your jurisdiction or agency have multi-sector greenhouse goals? In this chart, before I get into the results, see that the bars in the chart are green. Again, that refers to questions that are the answers refer to the jurisdiction or the agency. You'll see other charts coming up that have blue bars, and those refer to what you believe TPB should or should not adopt. I have to change glasses here. So 70% have of the jurisdictions respond to have greenhouse gas reduction goals or has endorsed COGS regional goals. There were, of the 31 responses that we received, 30 answered this question. There was one that was skipped. For each one of these slides, we do provide that information, as well as how many comments we received on that particular question. And you'll see on the right, we also identify the themes. We've grouped the number of comments by themes. And how many of those comments that we receive fall into those different theme categories. Do note that a comment could be assigned to one or more themes, so not necessarily, they may not necessarily add up. So the second question, does your jurisdiction or agency have specific greenhouse reduction goals for the on-road transportation sector? 48%, nearly half, indicated that they do. This was answered by 29 respondents, notably 2 skipped answering this question. So number 3, does your jurisdiction or agency support the TPB formally adopting the following levels of greenhouse gas reduction goals? 50% below 2005 by 2030, 80% below 2005 by 2050 for the on-road transportation sector. Notice the color of the bars changed, so this refers to what you think TPB should or should not do. And nearly 2/3 indicated that TPB should adopt the above levels of 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas reduction goals for the on-road transportation sector. 16% said that we should explore that a little further. For Part B, consideration of greenhouse gas reduction in decision making. The question was, is an assessment of the potential of a proposed project, program, or policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions reflected in your jurisdiction's or agency's decision-making? And just under half reported that it is part of that. A little more than a quarter said that you would be able to include the above considerations as part of transportation decision-making in the future. The next question, is your jurisdiction or agency's ability to include greenhouse gas reduction consideration in its decision-making impacted by other local, state, sub-regional, or regional entity that has a role in transportation planning and programming decisions of some projects or programs? And 81% of the respondents said that yes, they are involved in that, and there is an impact, so there's a very strong relationship there. On to the strategies. This was a series of questions that we asked on the review of strategies. I will probably get into these, but I do want to leave some time for questions. I do want to hit to some of the high points here. The first question is convert to clean, converting vehicles to clean fuels. In 2030, 100% of new light-duty vehicles sold, 50% of medium heavy-duty trucks, and 100% of all buses. And by 2050, all of these would be up to 100%. The question is, should the TPB endorse converting vehicles to clean fuels? And 45% said that TPB should adopt the strategy for the region and monitor its progress, while 42% said that TPB should conduct a more comprehensive examination of this. So none of these responses reflected the majority. 1B, to that, the question was convert clean vehicles to clean fuels with these set of goals, and what activity is occurring at the jurisdiction level. And I'm going to skip ahead here and just really focus on, in the remaining time, what the responses were on what you believe the TPB should or should not endorse here. So for part two, the second one, develop an electric vehicle charging network to the region to support an accelerated shift of light-duty vehicle cars and trucks to electric vehicles. 81% do support this, while 13% said that TPB should conduct a more comprehensive examination. For part three, the third question was add additional housing units above current COG cooperative forecast. That is about 77,000 additional units by 2030 and 126,000 additional units by 2050 near TPB identified high-capacity transit stations and in COG regional activity centers. In terms of what the preferences for TPB, the TPB should adopt this strategy for the region and monitor its progress. 57% of the respondents indicated that. Whether TPB should consult with the jurisdictional representatives on this matter, a third indicated that. This next question is a multi-part question. It concerns the jobs and housing distribution strategy evaluated in the climate change mitigation study, which was an exploratory perspective to determine greenhouse gas reduction potential and not based on a thorough feasibility analysis. The first question was concerning taking action to shift growth in jobs and housing from locations currently forecasted by COG through its cooperative forecast in locations near TPB identified high-capacity transit stations and activity centers within jurisdictional boundaries to improve the jobs and housing balance locally. In response to this, the members said that TPB should adopt this strategy. Less than 30%, 29% said that TPB should adopt the strategy. Rather, about 2/3 said that TPB should consult with the jurisdictional representatives on the specifics and implementation of this. For the next question, making all public transportation in the region fare-free by 2030, excuse me, and emphasizing bus here. And 23% of the respondents, just under a quarter, said that the TPB should adopt this strategy for the region and monitor its progress. 73%, nearly 3/4, said that TPB should conduct a more comprehensive examination of the implications and implementation actions of this strategy prior to TPB's adoption. The sixth question, making public rail transportation in the region fare-free by 2030. In response to this question, as far as TPB's adopting this strategy, only 7% supported that, while 73% said that TPB, again, should conduct a more comprehensive examination and implementation of this. The next question, making all public rail transport, excuse me, let me skip ahead here. The next question was pricing workplace parking for employees. In 2030, prices in activity centers would vary between $12 and $14 a day. In 2050s, prices in activity centers would vary between $20 and $14 a day and would be approximately $6 a day outside of activity centers. 27% said that TPB should support the strategy, while 43% said that additional implementation considerations should be examined before recommending that. There were a few responses in there, in the open responses, I will say, that said they do not support this. I took that extra effort to say that. For the 8th question, reduce travel times relative to 2020 travel times on all public transportation bus services. In other words, in 2030, travel times are reduced by 15%, and in 2050, travel times are reduced by 30%. 58% said that TPB should adopt this strategy for the region and monitor progress. 39% said that TPB should conduct a more comprehensive examination. For the 9th question, implement projects or programs to provide walk-bike access to all TPB-identified high-capacity transit stations. This one got a lot of support for TPB to take action to adopt this strategy. 90%, 9 out of every 10 responses indicated that TPB should adopt this strategy for the region, while only 10% said other. There was nobody that actually said they did not support this. The 10th question, complete the TPB's National Capital Trail Network to increase walk and bike trips throughout the day. This had a similar result as the previous question. There was 87%, nearly 90% in favor of TPB adopting this strategy. The next question, convert a higher proportion of daily work trips to telework. By 2030, this would be converting 25% of daily work trips, and by 2050, converting 40% of work trips to telework. 38% said that TPB should adopt this as for the region and monitor its progress, while 45% indicated that TPB should conduct a more comprehensive examination of this. So none of the responses got more than 50% of this in this response. The 12th question, charge a new fee per vehicle mile of travel by motorized private passenger vehicles in addition to the prevailing transportation fees and fuel taxes in 2030. In 2030, the fee would be 5 cents a mile, and in 2050, the fee would be 10 cents a mile. Only 10% said that TPB should adopt this strategy for the region, while 67%, 2/3, said that TPB should conduct a more comprehensive examination of the implications and the actions. And there were some that indicated that there is no support for this. The 13th question under Part C is to charge a cordon fee of $10 per motorized vehicle trip for all vehicles entering activity centers in the core of the District of Columbia by 2030. This received a 3% favorable vote for TPB should adopt this strategy for the region and monitor its progress, while 63% said that this should be looked at a little bit more closely. 33%, or a third of the respondents, indicated other and provided a lot of free responses in this question. The 14th question, implement traffic operational improvement measures at all eligible locations, including advanced ramp metering, enhanced incident management systems, active signal controls, and transit bus priority treatments. This received a lot of support. More than 3/4 supported this, saying that TPB should adopt this strategy for the region and monitor its progress, while 17% said that this merits further consideration and study. So I'm going to stop there and give you a chance to talk about this. I do want to conclude by, first of all, thanking my colleagues, Nicole McCall and Ken Joe, who were instrumental in designing the instrument, as well as pulling through all the data and performing all the analysis, all the charts you saw there, all the compilation of the data was a result of their work. I just wanted to thank them.
Great, thank you, Tim. I think this is really interesting to see how my colleagues around the region, how their jurisdictions looked at this survey. And we had, I can't speak for any jurisdiction but myself, but I know that my council and myself had quite the discussion as we went through these questions to be submitted. So let's take some questions on the results of the survey, including how they were tabulated and analyzed. If I may add, if you have comments or questions about what these results mean or how to use them, please hold your questions for the next item on the agenda, when staff will be presenting what they see as the takeaways from the responses to the survey. Since I can more readily see people here in the room. I will first call on those in the room who wish to speak and then ask Lynn or another staff member to identify those online that might have their hands raised. So let me get started with questions for Tim. I like the fact that you all read all the comments and tried to make it easy for us by identifying those 10 themes contained in the comments. When your team reviewed the comments, were there the most prominent themes that you observed other than what you've already told us?
Of the 10 themes we did observe, 2 of them actually got quite a lot. The more study / refinement is desired, that was one theme, as well as alignment with plan or activity. Both of those themes had over, respectively, 132 and 181 comments recorded throughout the survey, at any portion of the survey. All the remaining 8 had less than 100. I think the next closest to that was, it looks like limited authority or influence, and that was only 68. So those 2 really got a lot of the comments, and so those are issues that are clearly of top priority for you.
Great, thank you. I mean, I think it does show that most of us are all going to have to work together in order for any of this to go forward for all of our jurisdictions. So I'll take questions. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you again, Gary Ehrenrich, Montgomery County. That's a great presentation. It was a lot of work on the survey and a lot of work prior to get to this point, so I appreciate that. Is there any way you could go one level deeper in the analysis to try to explain the variation in the region in terms of the core, inner suburbs, outer suburbs? Because clearly to implement this, we're going to have to develop a regional strategy, and Montgomery County's goal is 100% reduction of greenhouse gases in 2035. So we're much more aggressive, and our actions have to be much more aggressive, but it depends on the infrastructure of the region, because we're part of a region. So is there a way you can at least give us a highlight of one level lower, and more detail about how the region responded?
That's not an analysis that we have done to date. Just compiling the results and providing the summary at the regional level was a bit of an exercise. That's something we can look into should the board express an interest in understanding the geographic variations. Having said that, I will note, though, that the appendix, that there were about 614 comments received, and many of them outlined what the jurisdiction's own goals were, and also provided links to their documents. So there is a way to look at that and say, so many of our member jurisdictions are thinking, they're acting on it, they're adopting goals at a multi-sector level. So the question is probably more on the part C. Which of those 14 strategies could we adopt as planning priorities at this time? That is probably where you might expect to see some variation or potentially even a trend in the responses. We have not had the time to delve into that, but we can certainly look into that. Having said all of that, one thing I will say is we did we read all of the comments 3 or 4 times, but some of them I read a few more times. Those were on the pricing strategies. Should we put a carbon fee in this region? Should we implement a VMT tax on top of all the fees that are currently paid? From my recollection, there was no jurisdictional geographic variation in the response to that. There was very little support for doing that at this time without a more detailed examination or an investigation of what are the implications of this. Implications on a personal level, implications at a jurisdictional growth level, revenue level, and importantly, the equity implications of something like that. So that's just an overview of what I can share with you.
So as a follow-up to that, is there a way that maybe in the next, a month or so, we could get more information about more details without necessarily identifying an organization, a jurisdiction, but to say, here seem to be the comments from the core, This is the inner suburbs and the outer suburbs. Because I think as a region, we have to trade off between what we can do and what other jurisdictions can do, because we have good public transportation, whereas other jurisdictions may not have sufficient public transportation to be able to commit to a goal if you don't have the basis for it. So I think, I think we need to go a little further, but it's a very good start. Thank you.
Thank you. I would agree. Obviously, I think everyone knows that, the inner suburbs definitely have more options when it comes to multimodal ways to get around than those of us that live in the outer suburbs. But again, I think these goals for me were to look at things that we can all come to some type of consensus and agree would be beneficial for everybody, just like you were saying, approving and making sure that bike trails are because people can get to a metro in your jurisdiction. And my jurisdiction, it's going to still be about road development so that we can get people to mass transits, like getting into 66 and into the metros and things like that. So I think as long as we all recognize that we are one big region and we all need to work together to get people moving around, I think that is the overlying goal for some of this, is my comment on that. Not that you asked for that, but that was my thought on it. Anybody else have any questions for Tim? Go ahead, Casey.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of my colleagues for filling this out. I agree with you, Chair Sebesky, that it really generated a lot of great discussion, so I think it was a helpful exercise, and thank you for all the work pulling this together. It's a huge undertaking and very helpful to see. What I've been trying to kind of wrap my head around is that category of more discussion is needed and kind of what that means, because I can imagine there's a wide variation in what that means to each jurisdiction who answered it. And so in some cases it might be, we would support this if it met XYZ criteria, or we would support this if it didn't impact, this particular critical area that we're concerned about, or we're very supportive, but we have this one concern, versus we're very hesitant, but we'd be willing to consider it. Was there any capacity in your reviewing to sort of give a sense of where the majority fell there? Because I don't want us to look at that more discussion is needed category and think that that's a no, because I don't think it's a no, we don't want to pursue this. I think it might just be nailing down the level of discussion needed before we can move forward on some of those aspects.
Sure. When I said we got 614 comments, those were on all of the questions, and there were multiple aspects of those questions. There were 20 questions. Some of them was, what should the TPB do? And some of them was directly asking the member, would you be able to implement it? So the comments fit in those two buckets. One general thing we can say, having read the comments, is all of the choices where when we asked what should the TPB do, the responses that said TPB should further examine this, the comments associated with that response generally were identifying implementation issues, right? So they were saying, look, this may be good for the region, but my jurisdiction does not have the authority to do that, because in a three-state region, the authorities that the local jurisdictions have are different. Another common occurring theme was, we need to understand the equity implications of this. And the third theme, if I could say, that was generally showing up was, how are we going to fund and finance this? That was particularly the case. It's a great thing to make transit free, whether it is bus or rail. How are we going to do that? WMATA's annual operating expense right now is around $2.4 billion, right? Even if 50% of that is through fare revenue. So I think that's the kind of thing. So I would agree with you that it is reasonable to say that those 7 strategies that the survey overwhelmingly said, we need to think about this more. I think it is reasonable to say it is not a no ever, but rather let us think through, let's be deliberate. Who can do this? What enabling actions would have to be taken for members to be able to even implement them. How would we implement them? How would we fund some of these programs? And how would we address the equity? So it's all about implementation. As we said in December when we presented the results, we did not consider implementation when we analyzed these strategies. Our chart, that would have taken us another year to do this study. Our question was, how far can we turn the knob if we are only focused on transportation and on-road? We recognized 80% of the 2045 land use is already here today. 80% of the 2045 population is already here today. So for those who believe we can make changes in land use, for those who believe we can make changes in the way people travel and the patterns of travel, those are all correct, but we will be essentially looking at that differential of 20%. The communities are already there. Some communities are extremely friendly and supportive of public transportation. Others are not, just because of the location where they are. But other forms of rideshare is amenable to them. So those are the kinds of things that those 7 strategies, in our view, will need to be thought through. How can we do that? And then out of those discussions, we might be able to say, it's not totally fare-free. Maybe it is reduced fare. And what does that look like? So once we are able to say, yeah, I think this might work for our region, for the way we are set up, then we have experts who can analyze them and say, yeah, if you did this, this is likely what reductions you might be able to achieve. Other than, that's only from greenhouse gases, but there'll be other benefits for sure. But the co-benefits and other things, we can do that.
Great. Chair Wheeler?
Yeah, just a real quick question. I see that there are 39 voting members and 31 responded. Is there a list, I've sort of gone through, is there a list of who actually responded? I mean, I can tell from the comments that have the names of the jurisdiction in the appendix. Is there any list that shows who responded?
We have that internally. We have not shared that. So we have 44 members. 5 of them are ex officio and generally representing federal agencies. So 39 are voting members and 31 did. So we haven't identified who voted or who didn't respond to the survey, but if that is information that members or board has an interest in, we can make it available.
Well, and I mean, the comments disclose who wrote which comments and things like that often.
Yes.
But I guess, I mean, that would sort of go to my colleague's question about inner versus outer and how many people were. I mean, I don't think that is disclosing anything anybody would want to not show, but maybe it would, we can talk about that.
Sure.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thanks. I want to build off of a number of things that, especially what Gary, Casey, and Conti have said. Because I think a deeper dive is going to be needed, and I agree with Casey that some of the responses, there might be a lot of nuance and somewhat of a delta within the responses that people have given. So I think a deeper dive is definitely merited. And I hear, Conti, what you're saying in terms of sort of the limitations of shifting land use. That said, and I understand a lot of the logistical challenges, I do think that, one of, if not the biggest thing that we can do as a region to address climate change, sustainability, equity, all in one shot, is to really double down and focus on how do we get, the housing jobs imbalance much more in sync, because just so much depends on it. So I think that they're, as difficult as and as heavy a lift as it is, I do think that there's an imperative. So I sort of going back, what do you see as next steps in terms of how to address these issues. And I also want to note that one of the presentations in the Tech Committee was particularly illuminating in this regard, where it showed a huge shift in the travel time, estimated travel times within the region, based on the tip inputs, and that especially for vehicular travel, there's just a very dramatic difference between the eastern part of the region and the western part of the region, and that's not good for anybody.
Okay. We're running close on time, but I know that Mr. Brown has his hand up, and then after that, we're going to probably move on, because I don't see anything online.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to disagree with my esteemed colleagues about doing a deeper dive. I think we have to avoid doing something I often do myself too often, which is overthink it. And the reason is we need to go back and look at what the original intent of the survey was and what the outline said, and that there would be anonymous, that people would not be, jurisdiction. The point of this was not to identify who made these comments, but it was just to make the comments. I also have a concern that in doing that, and that in a lot of our jurisdictions, we may have more than 2 people who are responding, and within that jurisdiction, and they could be totally different. There was no, even though everyone was asked to go back into their jurisdiction and talk about it, I don't know that there was any rule that you had to have a unanimous vote from your jurisdiction, that each member could be totally different than the other person, and they could be, out of balance. So I think we have to look at this on face value. Exactly what our chairperson said today is what the purpose of this was we're trying to get a majority. We were trying to think as to what may work, what could work, and I think you have that. So going into a deeper dive, I would say, it wasn't designed to do that, and I just, have to take at face value what you got out of this survey, very helpful information, and as I said, I don't think the deeper dive is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your comments. We're going to move on, and let's get to the third item on the agenda, the preliminary climate change mitigation elements based on the results of the survey for us to consider. Conti?
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'll be brief, and I really have just 5 slides. The purpose is to present the main topics of discussion for today and for continuing discussion next month as well. As part of the read-ahead packet, we provided a memo for this agenda item of the work session. It says item 9B on the top, and it has a copy of the slide deck and a memo. I suggest members have this memo handy for the reference during the discussion. I'll be noting the relevant pages of this memo during my brief. Right. So an outline of what I'll be presenting. Tim Kannan just reviewed the results of the TPB survey, which, as has been noted, was intended to get a sense of the board's collective sentiments on the 2 questions relating to mitigating climate change impacts within the on-road sector. So my briefing will present the 2 climate change mitigation elements that are being put forward for the board's consideration based on the results of this survey, right? So what are the 2 elements? 1, adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals specifically for on-road sector for 2 future years, 2030 and 2050. The second element is adopting a set of multi-pathway, multimodal on-road greenhouse gas reduction strategies as planning priorities. So what is meant by multi-pathway? Members will recall that the TPB's climate study looked at 3 ways in which on-road greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced. 1 was a set of strategies that strictly focused on changing the vehicle fleets from fossil fuel to clean fuel, electric or some other form of clean fuel. A second pathway is strategies that are strictly aimed at reducing the number of vehicle trips or the number of vehicle miles traveled on those vehicles, the VMT reduction strategies. And there was a third pathway, which is addressing some of the bottlenecks and the congestion and achieving a better efficiency in the traffic operations on our roadways. So those were the three pathways. That's why I keep calling these strategies as multi-pathways. Okay, so now to the first point to discuss today. Should the TPB adopt greenhouse gas reduction goals for the on-road sector? And if so, at what levels? A majority of the survey respondents, 65%, as Tim noted, indicate that the TPB should adopt greenhouse gas reduction goals specifically for on-road sector, and further, that those goals should be set at the same levels as the region's overall goals for multi-sector, which is by 2030, we will reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors 50% below 2005 levels and 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. So that's the response in the survey. Now, there were a number of responses which either had concerns about adopting the goals at those levels and wanted to further explore what would be the appropriate level at which we should adopt these goals. So it wasn't a question of we shouldn't adopt, but there was concern about those levels, 50% by 2030, 80% by 2050. So pages 3 and 4 of the memo has the summary results of the survey that I just cited, and it also has some of the comments that members provided. There were a total of 15 comments on this question alone, and all of these comments in detail may be seen on pages 6 and 7 of appendix to Tim's memo that he just reviewed. So one staff note, if I may, the TPB's climate study last year found that none of the 14 multi-pathway strategies that it analyzed, even a combination of the most aggressive clean fuel and VMT reducing strategies, would be able to reduce on-road greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. The most it would do is 38%. And that is if we adopted all of the most aggressive strategies. So as such, if today, based on the results of the survey in my next slide, you'll see, if we are not looking at all of the 14 strategies, but rather only a subset of those 14 strategies to adopt right now, then it is not clear what the pathway will be to achieving the 50% reduction by 2030. So just a note. So the second point to discuss later on would be which of the 14 strategies would the TPB wish to adopt as planning priorities at this time? So the survey revealed that a majority or a plurality of the respondents found 7 of the 14 strategies analyzed could be adopted as planning priorities at this time. The remaining 7 would have to be examined further. 4 of the 7 strategies received support from 75% or more of the respondents. So those 4 strategies are that we should develop an EV charging network for this region. We should improve walk and bike access to all high-capacity transit stations. We should complete the 1,400-mile National Capital Trail network. By the way, 50% of that is already done. And number 4, implementing traffic operational improvements and measures wherever it is appropriate. Those 4 had 75% support. 2 of the 7 strategies received support from over half, more than 50%, to be adopted as planning priorities. These 2 are reducing travel times for all buses in our region and adding additional housing units near high-capacity transit stations and the regional activity centers. One of the 7 strategies that overall said that we should adopt at this time, it was not based on a majority, but rather a plurality. And that is, the support was narrow. 45% favored it, 42% wanted to further explore. this strategy is converting our vehicles to clean fuel. So it was a little bit counterintuitive for us because we know that many of our member jurisdictions have active EV plans. They're working on EV implementation. There's a ton of federal money. So the response was a little counterintuitive. So we dug into the comments. And what we found looking at the comments was the concern was not with the strategy as a whole, but with some of the levels of conversion that was proposed in the survey for 2030. So we said, for example, in the next 8 years, 100% of every vehicle sold in our region would be EV or clean fuel. We said 50% of all heavy-duty and medium-duty vehicles sold in our region in 8 years would be clean fuel. So there was concerns that that may not be achievable. So it wasn't the strategy in of itself. So the second set of strategies were strategies that members have identified need to be examined further. As Ms. Kostick had asked earlier, and in my response to her, I noted, these are implementation issues have been identified, and they are different for each of these 7 strategies. And some of the implementation issues, like Gary noted earlier, are unique to the jurisdictions, whether they are in the regional core or in the outer suburbs. So there's a complex set of issues to be examined. But these are the 7 that members said that we need to look at them further, meaning perhaps these are not ready to be adopted as planning priorities at this time. 2 of the 7 strategies were identified by about 75% of all the respondents, and those 2 strategies were making all bus service free and making all rail service free. So 75% said, well, let's think about that. Let's look into that. 3 of the 7 strategies were identified by about 2/3, 66% or more, as to be further investigated. And these 3 are charging a new fee for every vehicle mile traveled, charging a cardon fee to get into some parts of the District of Columbia, and shifting even more jobs and housing near high-capacity transit stations beyond what is already reflected in our cooperative forecast. Looking at those comments, some of the inner jurisdictions found that they are already maxing out in that strategy. They weren't quite sure how much more they could do. It was not that they couldn't do it. It's a question of magnitude. And 2 of the 7 strategies were identified by a plurality, meaning of about 45%, as needing further examination. And these are that all workplace parking in our region would be priced. In our strategy, we identified by 2030, we will do it only in activity centers, but by 2050, everything will be priced. That's what we had talked about. So we need to think about that. Then increasing the proportion of teleworkers, even beyond where we are today. So there was some concern about how do we do that? What are the unintended consequences of that? It is probably not a difficult thing to implement and achieve. People are already started doing that. But if you are going to promote and aspire for high levels, what does that mean on a whole host of community planning issues? So those were some of the comments there. Pages 10 through 15 in the memo has the summary results for this question and also representative comments. There were about 91 comments received on these 7 strategies, and those comments can be found on pages 12 through 48 in the appendix to the survey results memo. So that's a quick overview of what we have in front of us. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Conti. So Conti discussed 2 elements, greenhouse gas reduction goals and greenhouse gas reduction strategies. To make efficient use of our time, here is my plan. Let's discuss these 2 elements in the order they were reviewed by Conti. We will start with the questions of adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals just for on-road sector. Should we adopt these and at what levels? Then we will discuss the on-road greenhouse gas reduction strategies that the survey indicates a majority or plurality support adopting as planning priorities. After that, we will discuss the on-road greenhouse gas reduction strategies that the survey indicates a majority believe need to be explored further. I will note that along with Conti, we are also joined by our staff, Mike Moran and Michael Grant from ICF, who conducted our most recent climate study, who would be able to answer questions and provide additional information during discussions. Let's begin with element 1, adopting greenhouse gas reduction goals specific to on-road transportation sector. So Conti said that according to the survey, 65% of respondents felt that the TPB should adopt greenhouse gas reduction goals for on-road sector and at levels same as the region's multi-sector goals, which is 50% reduction by 2030 and 80% reduction by 2050. Conti also said that no combination of strategies, even the most ambitious, would provide more than a 38% reduction by 2030. Perhaps in a way this is a philosophical question, but do we adopt aspirational goals that our analysis does not show we can achieve, or do we adopt ambitious, yet data-driven and feasible goals? I welcome any questions and thoughts. Please raise your hand if you would like to speak. I will start as earlier by calling on those in the room and then ask Lynn or the staff to recognize those online who have their hands raised. I will get us started with a question for staff. How many other metropolitan planning organizations, such as TPB, have adopted greenhouse gas reduction goals just for on-road sector, and are any of these at the levels that we are looking at?
I can take that. So in March and April, our staff did a survey of our peer MPOs, reached out to about 20 peer MPOs to find out whether they had greenhouse gas reduction goals in total and or for the transportation sector. And what we found was, first, it was hard to make an apples-to-apples comparison because different years are used. For example, we use a 2005 base year, and other agencies were using a 1990 base year. And second, different metrics were used. We're using total greenhouse gas emissions, and some places are using per capita greenhouse gas emissions. But the second finding was that although there are cities and MPOs that have transportation sector specific greenhouse gas reduction goals, we could find none that were as ambitious as the goals that are currently on the table here, the 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So the other finding was that most of the MPOs who have taken some action in this area have done so because their states have mandated it. We did not find examples where the MPOs themselves chose to take the action. It was in reaction to state mandates or legislation. Mm-hmm. So we did find some examples of MPOs that do have transportation sector specific greenhouse gas reductions. In California, the Sustainable Climate and Climate Protection Act of 2008, also known as SB 375, requires MPOs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles. The largest MPOs, LA, San Diego, San Francisco, and Sacramento, have a target to reduce per capita passenger vehicle greenhouse gas emissions by 19% relative to 2005 for the year 2035. So that's 19% compared to 50%. In Oregon, the Metropolitan Greenhouse Gas Reduction Rule requires the Portland area to reduce, again, per capita greenhouse gas emissions 20% below 2005 levels by 2035 and 35% by 2050. In Colorado, the last example I'll provide, they required greenhouse gas emissions associated with their Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP, what we call LRTP here. And their reductions, again, were based on total reductions, but we calculated percentage reductions. And for 2030, it would be a 7% reduction compared to baseline values. So again, these are much more modest than what we have on the table.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that it shows that this group has a great desire to talk and deal with climate change and have ambitious aspirations, so that's great. Anyone here have questions for Conti before we move on? Go ahead.
Thank you. Part of what we call...
Please turn your mic on.
Yes.
It's on, okay.
It is? Oh,
there you go.
but I have to eat it. So part of the, meta-analysis that we did, of course, when we see the results coming from the region, the first thing that we do is we compare our responses to see whether we are, in the middle, above or below. And that gives us already some insights, right? So, but getting back to the contribution, one of the key issues for me is what goal setting gives us the biggest bang for the buck. So where would we get the most out? And this is where we focus and see where we stand, whether we have majorities that would support action, et cetera. So part of the analysis that you did, Mr. Grant and Mr. Moran, was there was a lot contingent to the fuel mix of our electric grid. Yeah. And if I remember correctly, this was really a deciding factor. And this is not really on the road. This is something that comes from a different policy area. So how do we factor that in? And how does this factor in others?
So in terms of implementing strategies, right, so you can look at it as we are going to implement strategies that are totally we can control, right? We can do something. You want to price parking, you can do it. You want to provide reduced fares on transit, increase transit frequency, you can do it. There are certain other strategies which would either require legislation being enacted, so it's not entirely at the member jurisdictions level, but conceivably at the state level. And then there are other strategies that is going to depend on other sectors of the economy. Transitioning to clean fuel is one of the biggest transportation emission reduction strategy that is entirely dependent on another sector. So that's we should acknowledge that. But when we look at the results of the climate change mitigation study, it's interesting. The strategies that address vehicle trips or vehicle miles traveled, to a large degree, the contribution of the grid getting cleaner does not make it any more effective. There is some impact, but not a whole lot. But if we are pursuing strategies that are addressing vehicle fuel and vehicle technology, then the contribution of the grid going cleaner will be greater. So that's number one. The second thing I would say is you asked earlier, which of these 14 strategies give the most bang for the buck, sort of thing. The analysis indicated vehicle trip reduction and VMT reduction strategies have the potential to give you reductions sooner in the earlier years. But as those same strategies, as the years go on, become less effective because the vehicles generally have gotten cleaner. The vehicle fuel conversion strategy has greater potential in reducing greenhouse gases, but they take longer period to implement because of the kinds of things you're talking about. The vehicles need to be manufactured. They need to be available in sufficient numbers. They need to be affordable. There are ways to intervene to make all of these things happen, but it's all dependent on another sector, the manufacturing sector, a distribution sector, and the costing, the pricing of those things. And then it also depends on being able to transition to a cleaner grid. But we do notice that as the country, and certainly many other countries in the world, are moving much more rapidly towards transitioning. You see many local jurisdictions and agencies adopting renewable portfolio standards and purchasing their power from renewable sources. So those are just some high-level comments. Michael, would you want to add anything?
I was going to add quickly, as part of the analysis, we looked at these 10 scenarios, but we had 3 different grid assumptions associated with that. So you could look at the results of the study. For instance, we had a combination of strategies. It would reduce emissions by 27% under our reference grid, but 30% under a clean grid in 2030. The impacts increased by 2050 because at that point you have a lot more electric vehicles, and so the grid makes a bigger difference, as Conti noted. But I think when you're looking at setting a target, you can look at that combination of different scenarios and different grid assumptions. If you would like to kind of set a target that's more data-driven, to use that data to kind of estimate, well, what should be our targets or achievable.
Maybe what is behind my mind is what Kanti actually touched upon, is the timing and the impact. One of the biggest criticisms in implementation in other countries, for example, is that, yeah, we had goals, we implemented some strategies, they were kind of working so-so. We were measuring that, but then we found out that we are woefully behind. And then we had to adjust in a brutal manner, which was politically infeasible. And here we are, and we haven't achieved absolutely nothing. So for me, this is important because understanding how we stage this is part of actually the goal setting in the first place, whether we have, in quotation marks now, to shock and get to a shorter term result that allows us to ease into more difficult strategies, or for more long-term strategies. This balance, this policy mix balance is interesting to me, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Olmsted.
So my belief would be we would be better off adopting a strategy that is achievable. But I think when we look at the most aggressive strategies, we have to look at the cost of those, and that quickly becomes an equity issue. We have many folks in Loudoun County who cannot afford the cleaner vehicles. They cannot afford to live near transit, even though we're boosting our investment in attainable and affordable housing. But it becomes quickly very complicated. And so before I personally and on behalf of my county would support even a goal that is the most aggressive, I'd have to look at the price tag for some of my most vulnerable population.
Good point. Anyone else here before we go to someone online? We still have another, no, go ahead, Casey. Still have another element to talk about.
Yeah, and I'll be brief. I think, for me, we're in a crisis, a climate crisis, and I don't see us necessarily getting to the discussions and the activity that I think we need to have to figure out the details about how we get there if we're not taking the really aggressive action. So I completely agree that there are a lot of equity issues and things we need to figure out, but I think the more aggressive we can be as a body to set where we're going in that direction, to me that sets up the framework for having the discussions and allows us to set the course so we know where we're going and we know what sort of details need to be figured out. But I would urge us to think aggressively so that we can kind of outline the details as we go forward.
Ann, go ahead.
And real quick, just piggybacking on Ms. Umsted's comments, sustainability has to be sustainable, right? Which means that it has to be economically feasible. And people sort of gloss over that, but that's a key component. It has to be economically feasible. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have a high goal, but I do want to throw that in there that it would be nice to be able to have something attainable. just from a measurement standpoint, but it also should be economical.
This is where compromise comes in. Is there somebody online that would like to ask a question?
We have two hands up. Dave Snyder's first.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Snyder.
Hi, thank you very much for this discussion. Two questions or comments. First of all, I think in order for any large-scale goals to work, we need to set sub-goals based upon the next discussion item. That is, if we're going to pursue a particular strategy, then what are the goals for achieving that strategy? So I think there's a direct relationship to goal setting and strategies. General goals aren't worth a lot unless the sub-goals are much more precise and specific. That would be point number one. Point number two, in responding to the comments that have just been made, Conti, can you lay out for us what are the levers that TPB can use at this point, beyond just simply sort of planning and reports and, well, this would be a good idea to do this, that, or the other thing? What can TPB do in terms of actually setting priorities and directing funding to actually achieving whatever it is that we decide to do? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I think the TPB's, I'm a little reluctant to say authority, but the TPB's role is most effective and most direct in setting planning priorities. As members know, the TPB does not decide at the individual project level what project is to be implemented, what projects are to be funded, or when it is to be implemented. Those are essentially local decisions, and in Virginia, sub-regional decisions and state decisions. But the TPB has been most effective since early days in identifying. We understand that in this diverse region, different strategies work for different localities. Different localities have different authorities and governance structures, and therefore they would be able to pursue different projects. But we should, all of those projects, programs, if they are all moving towards this commonly and collectively adopted set of priorities, then we are making progress. So that is kind of how ICTPB can play a role. And they have adopted a set of such regional goals. We have goals about safety. We have goals about mobility, accessibility, the TPB vision document, regional transportation priorities plan, the aspirational initiatives. We spent 18 months and we identified 5 specific regional strategies. The climate change mitigation goal and strategies would be one more added to that. So that is how I see the TPB being effective, meaning hopefully the decisions that are being made at the local, sub-regional, and state levels, they would look at what are all the priorities that the National Capital Region have collectively said they want to pursue, and can we craft projects and programs that will advance many of them. It is hard to imagine a single project advancing all of these goals, right? So for example, we would love to increase teleworking because that would reduce VMT, it would reduce emissions. But we also know that a very large portion of our transit riders are telecommuters, and if you increase them, we should be prepared to accept lower transit ridership. But we also have a goal to advance transit ridership. So some of these goals could be, so therefore there are individual projects that might do more than one thing for sure, but would be hard to check all the boxes. So that is how I see the TPB being very effective in laying out the regional priorities.
Okay.
Madam Chair, Dave Snyder, just a follow-up question.
If we could just keep it brief, only because we only have 10 minutes left and there are other people that
Because I think it's very relevant about what TP actually can do. As I understand it, TPB also has to approve projects or they're not eligible for federal funding. So I just want to make the point that whatever it is we decide to do, and hopefully it'll be meaningful, that I want to understand fully all the tools that TPB can bring to bear. And I think just outlining and talking about priorities is too modest an approach for TPB. Again, assuming that we can decide on doing some things collectively. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else before we move on?
Yes, Mayor Jeanette Rochelle.
Okay, Mayor Rochelle, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. In all parts of life, I have never favored a course of action that sets up a person or a group for failure. So I would say that, in my opinion, what we do needs to be data-driven and the goals need to be achievable. And I am likewise concerned about the equity issues. Also, if we do not have reasonable goals, this could set up this body for future of tense discussions about meeting or not meeting the goals. We as a body do not need further sources of divisiveness, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Good points. So I'm going to move along because we are behind schedule a little bit. We're going to move on to the second element, the 7 strategies to reduce on-road greenhouse gas emissions. Those that a majority or plurality of survey respondents believe the TPB should adopt as planning priorities at this time. If staff can bring up that slide just for a couple of minutes, and then we can take it down. I believe Conti noted that there was overwhelming support for 4 of the 7 strategies, a little bit over 50% for 2, and for 1 that it was kind of close. Hopefully we will be able to come to an agreement on these. I welcome any questions and thoughts on these. Please raise your hand if you would like to speak. I will start by calling on those in the room, and then Lynn can recognize those that are online. I will get us started with a question. Conti noted that the support for converting vehicles to electric or other forms of clean fuel was almost a tie. What did the study find out about this strategy's potential to reduce on-road greenhouse gases? If the levels we assume for 2030 is too high, what other levels would be appropriate?
So the CCMS found that strategies analyzed in the survey to convert vehicles to clean fuels were some of the most effective strategies to reach our greenhouse gas reduction goals. However, it will be a challenge, one, to convert quickly from internal combustion engine motor vehicles to zero emission vehicles, or ZEVs. And to be most effective, this conversion must happen in tandem with the greening of the electrical grid, which we've already talked about, going to things like renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal. Also, regarding this question of which strategies are the most effective, this is somewhat difficult to analyze with the Climate Change Mitigation Study, or CCMS, because the study analyzed multiple strategies in scenarios. However, based on the literature review that was conducted by ICF and the study analysis, it's clear that mode shift and travel behavior strategies combined with pricing are very effective strategies. Do you want to add anything? Or?
Sure, I'll just add that we looked at, there were 2 technology scenarios. One of them assumed a 50% of new light-duty vehicle sales would be electric by 2030. The other 100% by 2030, which is what's listed here. That 100% is extremely ambitious and actually does go beyond some of the targets in California and some of the other states. It was kind of a high-level assumption that was used in the study. So one thing to consider is, that strategy has some very specific numbers to it. Some of the others, don't specifically define what operational improvements or specific percentages of roads that would be applied. So I don't know if you want to consider it as a more general strategy of converting vehicles to clean fuels or setting that specific target. But that was our most aggressive of the strategies, of the scenarios that we looked at for the clean fuels.
Okay. All right. Move on to a quick time check, Conti. I think it's about 11:40, so we don't have too much time left today.
Yeah. One thought, is we have 5 more minutes. I see this as a positive slide. These are strategies that members have indicated we should adopt. Earlier, Mr. Snyder and Gary and others have made the comment that if we can first look at the strategies that we all feel comfortable that we can adopt, then we can do some analysis to identify under those strategies what greenhouse gas reductions can we achieve, and that would go to the comments Ms. Umstead and Ms. Wheeler made, that our goals could also be data-driven and even though ambitious but attainable sort of thing. So this is a positive slide. So I'm suggesting maybe taking a little bit more time to see if, at least in this discussion, if members are generally comfortable or if they have any questions on this for that staff can help research and respond. Maybe we can come back next month on the remaining 7 strategies, which at this time the survey respondents have said, I don't think these are ready to be adopted at this time, but they're all worth looking into talking about further. So.
Yeah, okay. We need to see if there's any quick questions, and then we can talk about the 7 strategies that Conti just brought up, the ones that we thought needed more exploration.
We can hopefully conclude this, and that will probably eat up the time we have, and we can come back again for the next set.
Okay. Again,
so maybe one way is, anybody feels or have any questions or any concerns about at least the TPB considering adopting these as planning priorities?
Yes, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, thank you. I like what Mr. Snyder introduced, that topic, and I think we shouldn't necessarily separate the goals and strategies and the role of TPB. So state of good repair is always perceived to be the highest priority of funding. We've got to keep the system operating, whether it be transit, whether it be highway. I think either above or below that should be a discussion about greenhouse gas attainment and ability to move forward with strategies. So I would think that as we look at the next round, the 2024, this is an issue we can deal with. Deal with the 2024 call projects and allocation of funding. We should set some strict guidelines or some guidelines about how we introduce the compliance with some of the strategies that we will adopt and introduce, and what funding sources might we ask the states and look at the federal resources to actually dedicate among ourselves that we want to allocate X% of CMAQ, X% of other funding sources to achieve this. We need to allocate funds. We need to have goals, strategies, and funding. We need to show how those things work together. And we're really in a great position because of the work that TPB has done in the last year to come up in 2 years with another plan. So we're really in a great opportunity to take advantage of the work that's been done here and to be able to add a couple more issues or a couple more actions related to the call for projects. Thank you.
Anybody else here? What about online, Lynn? Okay, great. It's been a great discussion this morning, and I do think that we will continue to have the discussions of the many jurisdictions that serve on this board and the different needs that they all have. And what we have to come up with has to be able to meet all of those jurisdictional needs and aspirations, and find ways that all projects can be considered that'll meet those needs. It's obviously hard to tell what the outcome will be of all of this. I'm sure that this body can find an agreement on all 3 or at least some of the 3 items and determine what we need to hold, whether we need to hold another work session in May on this or not. I believe that this was a really good discussion. I appreciate everyone's time and attention. What we are engaged in now is not studying something, rather exploring the implementation of specific strategies to achieve certain outcomes. As such, I expected there would be some hard questions and concerns. I thank everyone for their participation and sharing of their thoughts. So, Conti, I assume you have a sense of where this group would like to go from here, and will be able to outline the next steps from these discussions. You can help me report out these discussions to the full board in a very short time. All of who participated please feel free at this time to chime in as well. Let us, this afternoon as well. I'd like to now offer everyone the opportunity to take a break, and we will reconvene at noon. Those that are at home may mute or turn off your cameras, and we will reconvene at noon, and this time everyone can take a brief break, and we'll come back. Thank you again. I think this is a really good discussion. Thank you.
Lunch is served, and it's in the room like it always is.
And I need more water.